Now back to the toing and froing of party politics. And sadly, this nation remains stuck in an emotional, often fact-free, polarised and unenlightening debate about climate change policy. Labor's latest effort is an uncosted climate virtue signalling move. It's a pledge to make Australia neutral on carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. That is, net zero emissions by 2050. So opposition leader Anthony Albanese is asking people to back Labor because it will deliver this outcome through some measures yet to be announced at some cost yet to be calculated. And you won't get to pick him up on how well this promise turns out or how badly it turns out unless you elect him in 2 years' time and then re-elect him in 2025 and 2028 and so on and so forth. In fact, you'll have to vote Labor for at least 10 elections before you can see if they make their target, they make good on that target, and then get to perhaps wreak your revenge in case they've failed to get there or they've sent us all broke doing so. Here's the Prime Minister now in Parliament on the counterattack today.
No plan, zero assessment of the costs, zero assessment of the impact, zero consultation, whether it be farmers or others, Mr Speaker, zero positive news for the Australian people who will be hit by a policy, if those off it were ever elected, with a higher price on electricity, a higher price on farming, a higher price on the checkout, Mr Speaker, a higher price on transport and petrol, Mr Speaker. A higher price is always what you'll pay under Labor, who just can't manage money.
Still, the opposition leader is not taking a backward step. He wants to keep talking climate policies.
So far in this parliament, the Prime Minister has used his numbers to shut down debate with me on 42 occasions. If the Prime Minister is so confident of his position, will he agree to a climate change debate at the National Press Club before the climate change conference in Glasgow this year?
It's all about you, Albo, isn't it, mate? It's all about you.
Anthony Albanese has lots of support, of course. The journalists, the public broadcasters, the celebrities and the activist groups are still all in on virtue signalling. They don't have much idea on policy and facts, mind you, but they are all in on targets and public gestures.
Dear Scotty.
Mate, sorry to do this to you.
But it's time to pull you up on your behaviour.
It's affecting everyone around you.
Australian communities are being devastated by
Unprecedented fires.
Extreme droughts.
And flash flooding.
All made worse by climate change.
Dear Scotty.
How will history remember you?
Someone who burnt with the world
Or help to save it.
Yep, all predicated on the bushfires, using the bushfires and drought and floods to push their political promises, their policy ideas. Oh dear. Albanese refuses to explain exactly what he wants to do and how much it will cost. There's a good reason for that, of course. He can't. The costs are probably incalculable, certainly when there's no detail to them. But he's running the same argument on costs that Bill Shorten ran in the lead-up to the last year's so-called climate election.
And one of the things that you have to ask, David, is what of the cost of inaction? You need to get Scott Morrison to front up. He's the leader of this country. He hasn't shown much leadership lately, which is why people are so disappointed in him.
OK, let's stick to your...
He needs to answer. Well, he's the government. He needs to answer what is the cost of inaction.
There is a cost of inaction.
Well, Albo and Spearsy, for that matter, are wrong there. If you take out the politics and the ideology and inject some facts and rational arguments, there is, of course, no cost to Australian inaction. We had the latest figures released today that this nation has again reduced its greenhouse gas emissions, only slightly, mind you, but this is what we've been doing. Even though the population is growing, along with our economy sluggishly, we are reducing emissions. We've met our Kyoto targets, and we will meet our Paris targets too. But what's the rest of the world doing? Here's what all the data and all the research shows. Global carbon emissions continue to rise. The green line here is the one you should be looking at, by hundreds of millions of tonnes each year. Across all scenarios, short of a global recession, emissions will be far higher globally in 2050 than they are now. Now, this will obviously be the case whatever Australia does. Our 1.3% and reducing share of emissions makes little difference. Our emissions cuts, while world levels continue to rise, obviously do nothing. So if we did nothing, there would be no cost through additional climate consequences, obviously. There would be savings because we wouldn't have expensive policies. But there'd be no cost when it comes to climate consequences. We are stuck with whatever global emissions the rest of the world decides to give us. Now, as I've said before, we ought to be cautious and prudent and do our bit. But it's silly to suggest there is a cost penalty on us in 2050 or sooner from economically damaging climate change. Bjorn Lomborg has calculated the climate outcome if every country in the world met its Paris targets. And they won't. We know already countries like Germany, for instance, will miss them by a decade or more. But as Lomborg says, if we measure the impact of every nation fulfilling every promise by 2030, the total temperature reduction will be 0.048 degrees Celsius by 2100. If they all meet their targets, which we know they won't, the impact on global warming will be to reduce it not by a degree, not by 1/10 of a degree, but less than half of 1/10 of a degree, as near as we can measure or calculate these things. Imagine the infinitesimal difference to that if Australia meets its targets or not. Climate policy is important. There's an argument for us to do our bit, and we already are doing most than most nations here in Australia. So let's not pretend that inaction is in the mix, and let's not pretend we haven't had worse bushfires before. Let's not pretend we haven't always had droughts and that they don't usually also end with floods. Let's not pretend Australia can change the global climate. And let's not pretend that there are known costs to not doing more. Labor is using that as a blatant smokescreen for not coming clean about the actual costs of what it plans to do extra.